The last thing my mother ever said to me was, "Don't make this harder for your brother." And in that moment, standing there, holding the truth she refused to hear, I realized she'd never seen me as anything more than the daughter who should stay quiet and step aside. My name is Vienel Starling, and that was the day I learned silence wasn't protection, it was erasure. And I promised myself if they ever tried to cut me out again, I wouldn't just speak. I'd burn the lie down to the foundation. I came back to New Hampshire on a cold October morning, the kind where the air carries a sharp edge, red maple leaves scattered across the driveway, as if the place had been waiting for anyone but me. 7 years had passed since I last stepped onto this porch, yet the house looked untouched, frozen in the same quiet judgment I remembered. On the flight from Denver, I told myself I was ready for this. I'd handled real emergencies before, but nothing prepared me for the stillness inside that door. The cedar scent hit first, faint and familiar, followed by the sight of the old hallway shelf. My photo at 12 was still tucked behind Caleb's. Same spot, same message. My father murmured a greeting. Caleb leaned against the kitchen railing, wearing that smug half-smile that always made me feel like an uninvited guest. "So you finally made it back." I didn't answer. My attention had already shifted to the embossed envelope on the counter, the invitation to the will-reading expensive paper carrying a weight that felt more like control than courtesy. Dinner was exactly as I remembered everyone talking about the mill, about how the town expected Caleb to step into his rightful role. I ate quietly, listening without belonging. Later, in my mother's study, I reached behind a shelf and pulled out a crumpled draft of her will one that split everything equally. A cold shiver ran through me, just as a soft knock sounded behind my back. Harrison stood in the doorway, eyes heavy. "Vienel, your mother left you something they were never meant to find." Harrison led me to the small cabin at the edge of the woods, the one he'd worked in for most of his life. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept through and set the brass wind chime above the frame rattling. Its low, raw vibration scraped at something inside me, instantly reminding me of my mother's strained voice in her final days. He didn't bother with small talk. He walked straight to an old cabinet, pulled open the bottom drawer, and lifted out a thick envelope tied with a faded cloth ribbon. My name stretched across the front in my mother's unmistakable handwriting for Vienel, open only when necessary. I sat in a wooden chair stiff with age. My fingers trembled slightly as I loosened the ribbon. Inside were 5 items laid flat and deliberate: a map of the forest with 4 red marks clustered in the northern section, a torn journal page with my mother's unfinished line, "Caleb isn't," several invoices for chainsaw parts that didn't match anything the mill should have been buying, a cluster of photos showing young trees cut before their time, and a small USB drive. I slid the USB into the old laptop on the desk. The screen flickered to life, then settled into the dim amber light of my mother's face. She looked exhausted, as if the weight of something she hadn't said was dragging her down. "If you're watching this, Vian, I'm probably gone." I held my breath. I thought Caleb was only having money troubles, but someone's been lending to him. And the forest. "You need to check the north section. It isn't what he told you." A sudden, sharp bang erupted behind her. She flinched, and the screen went black. Harrison's voice cracked behind me. She planned to bring all this to a lawyer, but she changed her mind. She said it needed to go to you. I stared down at the map again. The red marks sat exactly on the piece of land she used to call the Sacred Patch, her favorite place since we were children. A cold instinct crawled through me. The new will wasn't simply a choice she made. Something pushed her. And whatever it was still here. At dawn, I followed the map north. The farther I walked, the more the forest shifted into something unrecognizable. Deep tire tracks carved into the ground, soil packed tight by heavy machinery. Young stumps lined in uneven rows, trees barely 7 to 10 years old, cut clean through by industrial-grade saws. Fresh wood chips littered the ground, still bright with exposed sap. I knelt beside a stump. The cut was smooth cold, mechanical. Someone had been harvesting aggressively. Footsteps snapped a branch behind me. "Best not wander up here. Vion." Caleb leaned against a freshly felled trunk, hands in his coat pockets. eyes sharp and unreadable. "You don't belong here anymore." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving the cold to fill the space he'd emptied. I watched him disappear through the trees and knew I needed answers he wasn't going to give. The mill was quieter than usual. I slipped through the back hallway and into the room Caleb had forbidden me from entering since childhood. The padlock was new, but the hinges were old. With a little force, they gave. Inside, the truth sat waiting. Stacks of bank notices, loan agreements from a predatory lender, a contract showing the mill had been pledged months before my mother died. And at the center of the pile, a timber sale agreement with a private logging company, the same name printed on the invoices from my mother's envelope. None of the signatures belonged to her. They were imitations. The strokes too long, the pressure uneven. The overhead lights snapped on. Caleb stood in the doorway, shoulders taut. "You never should have come back." His voice no longer sounded like family. And in that moment, I understood exactly why my mother had changed her will at the last possible moment. She wasn't choosing between us. She was trying to save what she could before everything collapsed on top of her. My hands shook the moment I saw Caleb blocking the doorway to the records room. For a split second, I saw the brother who used to carry me on his shoulders through shallow creeks. But that boy was gone. The man in front of me was someone I could no longer read. "You're digging through things that aren't yours," he said, voice low and heavy. I forced myself to stay calm. "I just want to understand what happened to Mom. Not your concern." He slammed the door behind him, the crack of wood echoing through the hall. I hugged the stack of papers to my chest and slipped past him before he could say anything else. My heart raced, but my mind raced faster. If he mortgaged the mill before Mom died, was that why she rewrote her will? When I returned to the cabin, Harrison was still at the table, hands pressed against the forest map as if holding the land steady. He looked up slowly. "You may need to check the locked room in the mill, the one your mother kept for important things." A chill moved through me. That room had always felt like a line I wasn't supposed to cross, a place sealed off with more than a key. That night, I drove back alone. The mill stood dark except for the thin beam of moonlight slipping through the rafters. I used my mother's old key. The lock clicked open. Pine dust and cold air rolled out as I pushed the heavy door in. Inside were boxes labeled Private M.S., a larger safe, and a single leather-bound journal resting on top. Brown, silver-edged, with a small V pressed into the corner. "If you're reading this, it means you're ready to know everything." Mom's handwriting unfolded across the pages, Caleb's debts starting 2 years earlier, his first secret timber sale behind her back. The cash paid off the books, his promise to repay her. But he didn't stop. And on the last page, her words tightened into something raw. "If you found this, Vian, I fear Caleb can't stop anymore." My stomach dropped. Caleb wasn't afraid of losing the inheritance. He was afraid of losing his cover. And now, I was the only one carrying the truth. When I closed the journal, my eyes caught something near my shoe. A wet streak of mud on the floorboard. Fresh. Someone had been here before me, and whoever it was had been watching. By morning, Caleb was in the kitchen pouring coffee like the night before never existed. I set the journal on the table. "Explain." He barely glanced at it. "You don't get to question me." I flipped to the forged mortgage signature. The pen strokes were wrong. Shaky. "This isn't Mom's handwriting." His silence lasted 1 second, just enough to confirm he knew. "And didn't care. You think this town trusts you, I stayed. You ran." The smugness in his voice wasn't confidence. It was entitlement. He truly believed the will reading would crown him. I left before the rage could choke me and drove to the estate attorney's office, only to be told I wasn't on the list. My name had been removed entirely. Caleb had already meddled with the process, back at the cabin. A thick envelope waited under the door, a formal warning from Blue Mountain Timber Corp: stay off the northern property. The land wasn't theirs, but they acted like it was, meaning Caleb had already promised them timber that didn't belong to him. That night, when I turned on the kitchen light, I froze. A muddy handprint smeared across the glass, still wet. The forest outside was unnervingly still, as if holding its breath, Caleb wasn't just hiding secrets anymore. He was tracking my every move. I barely slept after seeing the muddy handprint on the cabin window. Every corner of the room felt watched, every shift of light a warning. I locked my car keys in the bedroom, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. But by morning, the message became clearer. The rear left tire hung flat against the dirt. A clean puncture pierced through the rubber. When I pulled the steel spike free, the ridged pattern told me exactly where it came from the mill. Caleb's territory. It wasn't subtle. It was a declaration. Harrison gave me a ride toward the woods, his sigh heavy. They won't stop. Vion? Halfway down the road, a police cruiser blocked our path. Officer Miller stepped out, radio still crackling on his shoulder. He said a report named me as the person damaging property in the northern sector. Anyone else would have found the accusation laughable. I couldn't. The report had Caleb's fingerprints all over it. I reminded Millers the land belonged to my mother. He countered with recently filed documents. Blue Mountain Timber had temporary lease rights, quick filings, fake permissions just enough to make the badge believe them. When I finally reached the northern woods, the real damage showed itself. 2 of the cameras Mom installed were smashed. The third was twisted downward. Someone knew exactly where they were. A size 12 boot print crushed the wiring Caleb's size. He wasn't hiding what he'd done. He was wiping the trail clean. Near a brush pile, a torn contract fluttered against the ground. I pulled it free and felt my chest tighten. Caleb Starling agrees to deliver the first 300 tons by November. 300 tons. A number that meant not carelessness, but a full-scale gutting of the forest. The signature below a shaky imitation of my mother's hand made my stomach turn. A cold gust cut down my spine. Behind me, a dry leaf snapped. I spun around. Nothing. Yet the certainty settled in my bones. He was close. Too close. By late afternoon, the house glowed with warm autumn light, but stepping inside felt like crossing into enemy territory. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with an envelope marked from the estate attorney. You're officially removed from the will reading. Mom wanted it that way. Inside, her signature stretched unnaturally long, poorly forged. Caleb shrugged it off, blaming her frail hands. The casual cruelty made something inside me go cold. Family didn't help. Lorraine dodged my questions. Henry muttered about Caleb carrying burdens I'd never understood. Old town logic surfaced the loyal son stays. The daughter leaves. They'd all decided who deserved the legacy. At the attorney's office, the assistant barred the door. You're not listed as an involved party. I'd been erased point blank. Another envelope waited at the cabin Blue Mountain Timber again. This time, they threatened criminal charges for interference. They weren't just pushing me out. They wanted me frightened enough to stop. My phone rang just as my hands were shaking from the letter. Rebecca Miles introduced herself, calm but direct. She'd reviewed everything I'd sent and believed my mother had done something Caleb never discovered: a conservation easement. If it existed, she said, it could overturn the entire will and expose every illegal cut Caleb made. The wind slammed against the cabin walls as I stood there, gripping the phone. A single truth rising in my chest, I finally had the key to unravel everything. But the fight ahead would be the hardest yet. The entire town felt wound tight that afternoon, as if everyone had gathered for a moment they'd been expecting for years. The town hall was overflowing neighbors who'd known my mother forever. Former mill workers, distant relatives, even representatives from timber companies. I stood at the back, gripping the handle of my suitcase, everything inside it pulsing like a heartbeat. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Caleb walked onto the stage with the air of someone stepping into his destiny. His tailored gray coat, his practiced smile, he looked like a man convinced the world already belonged to him. Grant opened the folder and read the will naming Caleb as the sole heir to the forest. The mill. Every asset. Applause exploded. Someone even whistled. My father's proud stare burned brighter than the overhead lights. No one looked at me. When the cheers died down, I rolled my suitcase forward. The wheels thudded across the wooden floor, a sound that made the room turn. Grant scowled, reminding me I wasn't on the list. Caleb told me not to embarrass myself. I didn't respond. I opened the suitcase and laid everything out: the maps, the invoices, the forged documents, The easement? Then I played my mother's video, her voice trembling through the hall. When it ended, I spoke clearly. Caleb hadn't inherited a forest. He'd inherited a protected conservation area, one he had already violated. His face drained of color, and the whole room went still. Silence hit the hall so hard it felt physical. As if the air had been sucked straight out of the room, Caleb stumbled back a step, his face twisting like someone had punched the truth into him. Grant reached for the conservation easement with shaking hands, staring at the red New Hampshire seal as though it were a detonator. No, that's impossible. Mary never mentioned. Rebecca stepped forward from the back, her heels clicking with a finality that cut through the tension. Her voice sliced through the room. She didn't have to. The easement was certified a month before she passed. From that day forward, this land has been protected in perpetuity. A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. She lifted another document. Every contract to sell, harvest, or moor or diggage this forest is null, legally void the moment the easement went into effect. A mill worker shouted from the middle rows, his voice cracking. Then those trees that got cut, were those illegal? Rebecca nodded once. Not just illegal, felony-level environmental violations. Gasps rippled like fire across dry grass. A representative from Blue Mountain Timber shot to his feet. He signed contracts with us. He said he had authority. Rebecca turned on him. And you believed him without verifying land status. The man sat down fast. I opened my mother's journal. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She wrote, "If Vian finds this, it means she must finish what I couldn't." She didn't change the will to shut me out. She did it because Caleb's debts were drowning her. She was trying to save the mill from being seized. A murmur of disgust swept the hall. Several workers shook their heads, whispering that he'd gone too far. That was when Grant cracked. She told me, she said. She didn't want trouble. Rebecca stopped him cold. If you ignored a legally filed easement, you'll be investigated. Grant collapsed into his chair. Then came the moment that sealed Caleb's fate. He exploded, shouting, spit flying. I didn't have a choice. I had debts. What do any of you know about responsibility? He jabbed a finger at me. She left for years. Everything fell on me. The room stiffened. He didn't realize he'd just confessed in front of 40 witnesses. I stepped forward, laying my hand on my mother's map. My mother didn't leave the forest to Caleb. She left its protection to me. Heads bowed. Respect shifted. The truth was no longer hidden. And every mask in the room finally fell. 3 months later, the town that once pulsed with rumor and tension had settled into a strange kind of quiet, one that comes only after something breaks wide open. People went back to their routines, but nothing truly returned to normal. The aftermath of the will scandal had carved deep lines through the lives of everyone involved. Caleb was under active investigation for illegal logging, forged documents, and financial manipulation. Blue Mountain Timber faced massive fines and lost their license after the state reviewed their operations. Starling Mills, the place that had shaped generations of my family, shut down temporarily for a full audit. And Grant, the attorney who had enabled Caleb's scheme, had his law license suspended. The same people who once saw Caleb as the golden son now avoided saying his name in public. I left New Hampshire behind and returned to Boulder. The forest back home would now be monitored by the state, protected the way my mother always wanted. But I knew the responsibility she entrusted me with wasn't something I could walk away from emotionally. Protecting that land had become part of my spine. One morning, as the first thin layer of winter snow began to settle across the Flatirons, my father knocked on my door. He carried a soft canvas bag, holding it with a care I hadn't seen from him in years. Inside was my mother's moss-green sweater, the one she'd knit slowly, stitch by patient stitch. "I think you should have this," he said quietly, his voice catching. I asked if he came because of Caleb. He shook his head. "I came because I was wrong about you. I thought your silence meant you didn't care. But you were holding everything together in ways I never understood." I held the sweater to my chest and let its warmth spread through me before answering. I never needed to win. "Dad, I just needed Mom's truth to stay intact." That afternoon, I climbed Flagstaff Mountain, Snowflakes collected on my hair, the world below glowing like a scattered constellation. In the wind, I could almost hear her voice, soft, steady, certain. You did it, Vion. For the first time in my life, I felt the quiet inside me as strength, not surrender. I had protected the forest, protected her legacy, and finally, protected myself, 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 protected myself.